speaker. Dr. Abby Tabor is a lecturer at the Department of Health at the University of Bath. Abby's done a lot of great processing and Bayesian approaches to our understanding of pain perception. Today, she will be talking to us about embodied active inference and how this can be applied to understanding of how we go about designing and organizing our cities.
Thanks, George, and thank you to the broader SPECT team. It feels like an extreme privilege to be able to present some of this as a proposal, really. And yeah, it's to second Lisa's comments yesterday, it's intimidating to be presenting to the people that really encouraged me to do a PhD in the first instance with the work that they completed. So it's a great honour for me. And yeah, I had a chat with Mark ahead of this as to whether I stick with kind of what I've done in relation to pain and trying to understand that from an active inference perspective, or sort of go for the undone work and the proposal for what is next, and the off-piece version of this. So hopefully a proposal that stimulates conversation in the first instance, and critique. So yeah, I'll just share my screen. I'm also hoping that the fireworks in my background aren't infiltrating my sound. Is that now on your screens? Is that okay? So yeah, essentially my talk will focus on a proposal borrowing somewhat a concept from the sociologist Richard Sennett on the uses of disorder. Richard applied the idea of disorder in terms of how we design our cities for our communities, encouraging interaction with strangers, the ability to live alongside people with different cultural beliefs. I'm using the concept of disorder to sort of link that with an active inference approach to how we might take an understanding of design that can be applied from the microbiome to the metropolis in the context of ill health. So, as George mentioned, my background has largely been working within the field of pain and trying to understand why people continue to experience pain in the absence of injury. And an active inference framework has been useful to me in trying to make sense of this. To summarize sort of 8 years of work in a single paragraph, very crudely, that kind of involved putting persistent pain in terms of its occurrence as an inability to refine a generative model in the absence of exploratory action, which often accompanies the protective component of the pain experience, where we have this protective action that looks to ensure healing and recovery. But at the same time, it seems to sit in sort of contrast to our ability to refine and update a generative model that protective action is necessary. What I would like to be able to do is take similar concepts outlined under the active inference framework as a theoretical model to help make sense of more broadly the occurrence of chronic illness and the experiences people have alongside that. So the proposition that sort of has the center of this, or at the center of this talk, is that chronic illness is an inevitable consequence of our built environment, the way in which it is built currently. And this is designed to be relatively provocative and something that is far-reaching in its scope. And I guess sort of to talk alongside Paul's comments in terms of where is the scope or the limit of our explanatory power with these frameworks? Am I pushing it too far in this proposition? And how does that translate so it's not just so story? So my starting point is really evolution, as for us all. A contextual mismatch that we find ourselves in. We have evolved to efficiently accommodate uncertainty, driving coherent action in a changing environment. Yet the environment in our recent history seems fundamentally different to the one in which we evolve the mechanisms to which to deal with and accommodate that uncertainty. Really what I'm pointing to is that we are existing in an environment that is increasingly under our own control. We have the ability to minimize the uncertainty that we encounter. In so doing, the priority, and this is work that and discussions that I've had with largely architects and urban planners in terms of the priority for designing our spaces in the built environment. We're predominantly designing for safety and comfort. And this is relevant really in the sense that we're faced with rapid urbanization. So it's worth potential scrutiny in terms of what is of this prioritization of design. We're witnessing a rapid urbanization, and there's a projected 68% of the population to be living in cities by 2050. This move towards environments that are fundamentally designed to protect the body from perturbation, whether that be temperature, light, noise, physical exertion, or at the microbial level, is worth discussing in terms of its broader impact on essentially what we see really is, and again broadly speaking, a sanitization of our environments for safety, comfort and efficiency in the short term. But is this really at the cost of diversity? And in terms of urban environments, that seems to be the case, particularly biodiversity. An avenue or a field that the sort of concept of how cities are designed has been discussed from the advent of cities, whether that be around how we design cities around food networks, to how we design modern cities, such as Paris and the 15-minute city agenda. Some examples of how sociologists and architects look at designing cities in relation to creating order or perhaps disorder. And this is a famous proposal by Le Corbusier, an architect of the 20th century, who put forward a plan for how to essentially navigate and establish a network within Paris. It was never realized. However, it's just an example of how different perspectives look to design a city and around the occupants. Le Corbusier's approach was really about controlling the interactions that individuals had within their local environment, a grid-like repetitive pattern that predetermined one's interactions within the city, limited scope for interpretation, uncertainty, and perturbation. At the other end of the spectrum, we have an idea of the open city, which was something that's widely discussed by Richard Sennett and his collaborator Pablo, and they've recently released a book that looks at disorders within the city, essentially proposing that an open city is one that is not predetermined, something that enables redefinition over time. And although this is an example in Delhi, I think of when I spent time in London and lived in Camberwell and just down the road from Elephant and Castle, where the roundabout there, which has now been overhauled, I believe, is a good example of how sort of disorder brought together sort of multiculturalism. And really this proposal is really taking these concepts of open and closed cities and looking at them with the lens of an active inference approach. But to start to sort of continue to set the scene, the sort of global challenge that this is drawing upon is this idea of rapid urbanization, more people living in a smaller sort of space, and the associated health that carries with it. What we're seeing is this increasing prevalence of chronic diseases, whether that be the classic non-communicable diseases of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer, as well as mental health. But seeing these two, and what I'm proposing this interlink, or what others have proposed as well, these twin challenges facing humanity currently, which I've somewhat cherry-picked. However, looking at the relationship between the two, and how we can look at urbanization as really a way of intervening within this realm. This is something that has been highlighted recently with the set the bigger picture, in terms of outlining how multiple goals that face humanity essentially requires multidisciplinary approaches in order to intervene effectively. And urban health is one of the key factors here, pulling together different disciplines in achieving that. So to focus on chronic disease and why that is relevant here, I guess to set the scene, we're living for better. A third of adults are living with more than one chronic illness, across the spectrum of illnesses that have symptoms lasting longer than a year, much longer in most cases, whether that be mental health, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, to name but a few. So we have this issue in terms of people, how do we create environments in which people are thriving, rather than environments in which people are suffering. And there's been work done, in particular, I know Harry Rutter, who works at the University of Bath in the policy department, that has looked at the way in which interventions are orientated towards these chronic diseases. And there is sort of a spectrum to consider, from the sort of systemic drivers, the structural factors, the policy implementations. And I forgive me, this example is taken from obesity literature, which is quite well developed in terms of complex systems. But the idea of taking the sort of policy end of the spectrum that discusses how we can intervene in terms of sugar taxes, for example, all the way down to the molecular level, where the intervention becomes much more targeted through drug therapy or surgery. What we found in some of Harry's work isolated was that the vast majority of interventions are orientated towards the right-hand side of this spectrum, where individual behaviours are targeted to enforce change and try to target risk factors. And the burden there falls on the individual to make changes within their environment. And the bigger question for me is that, are we creating the environments that enables that to occur? Or in other words, are we creating the environments in which people can thrive and make those choices? And I think that sits within the proposal that I'm trying to make from the framework perspective. What Harry's work led to was this idea that you can't approach this as a unitary thing when you're dealing with complex systems. And a complex systems approach to something like this really brings in the biopsychosocial, as Paul was talking about, and how this links to the active inference or the predictive framework. The idea of having multiple players involved in the way in which we interact with the world. And this is a horrible looking diagram and relatively messy, but taken from physical activity realm, essentially trying to categorize all the different variables, whether biological, social, psychological, that impact our ability to exercise in this case. What this really draws out is that we can see how intertwined and multiple the factors that could be influencing the decision to exercise can be, and simply intervening in one aspect is insufficient when we're dealing with complex systems. What I find difficult with these approaches is the translation into, well, how do we start to look at the way in which we can intervene and readily understand its impact across such a system. And in many ways, this is calling out for a sort of a unified approach to be able to categorize different variables and their impact on the complex system you're wishing to investigate. depending on the level that you look at, and this sort of spans the structural level all the way to the molecular, and that's something that I'll draw upon for the next couple of slides in terms of how we can look at the problem that feeds into, in this case, chronic illness. The infrastructure of the built environment is a nice one to start with, looking at overt behaviour, and this allows me to sort of draw upon the work of Gibson that informed also my work in pain, that the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. And I think this is a really poignant statement in trying to understand how the environment affords particular behaviours in relation to chronic illness. And some examples of this, on the left-hand side, work that was done by Ed Baggs in Canada, looking at the concept of affordances in terms of cycling infrastructure and the way in which we design our bike lanes in relation to essentially a car-dominant society. On the left-hand side, the far left, is looking at how usually, and I've cycled many of these cycle paths that involve a left-hand turn across a cycle path with no separation between the cars and the bike. Conversely, looking at B, where you have segregation that enables potentially the ability to prepare for oncoming threat, at least providing the information to the cyclist that would otherwise be unaware. The right-hand side is just an example at the sort of urban planning level, where you have opportunities for action that essentially are contradictory in terms. To go from the infrastructure and at the gross behavioural level to trying to make sense of the role in which biodiversity and the molecular level have in ill health, and if we're looking at a complex system, how we start to consider the molecular level in regards to that. And there's increasing evidence to support in support of enhancing biodiversity to improve resilience of ecosystems and public health more broadly. What is afforded by a biodiverse environment can be considered restricted in the urban environment. When we develop urban environments that are orientated towards control and efficiency and comfort, biodiverse environments seem to be sacrificed and narrowed. This has been formalised by Graham Rook at UCL under the old friends hypothesis that gives us an idea of this interaction between the biopsychosocial impact across the hierarchy. The whole old friends hypothesis has been applied to trying to make sense of the occurrence of chronic inflammatory disease in urban communities. And Graham Rook talks about largely these inflammatory diseases focusing on autoimmune disease, allergy, inflammatory bowel disease, but also extending towards psychiatric conditions. The hypothesis essentially proposes that, and it extends work that was done by Strachan in terms of the hygiene hypothesis. It proposes that a reduced exposure to immunoregulatory macro and microorganisms exposes poor regulation of inflammation. This idea that with a restriction in the exposure, largely early in life, there's evidence that microbiome sort of diversity is sort of flourished within sort of from birth to 3 years. But the idea that a restriction in this exposure can have a direct impact to our ability to mount an appropriate immune response. What this work attempts to do is build a link between the immunoregulatory deficits and the biopsychosocial stressors, which may lead to a reduced stress resilience in modern urban communities. And Graham has sort of presented various iterations of this in relation to the old friends hypothesis. And I think what's relevant to note principally about this work is often it is based on cross-sectional and correlations that expose a relationship, but the causal impact or the causal relationship is very unclear. and the extension into humans. Largely this work has been done in relation to germ-free mice models. And that extension into human models, where the number of confounders, and there's been recent work that's looked at the role of the microbiome, where considering the confounders, that work is less than clear about the causative role there in terms of chronic health. So trying to extend this work is imperative to make sure that this link is something that is actually there, or simply a function of a correlation analysis. Work that's been done in Adelaide has tried to push this work a little bit further in terms of intervention, to consider whether in developing an intervention that's around the idea of diversity can have an impact. They bring in and employ this idea of the holobiont, which encompasses the host and its microbiota, looking at the relationship between the host, such as ourselves, our microbiota of the body, as well as the microbiota we come into contact with in the environment, and how this is impacted by urbanization. What they're attempting to do is essentially look at how transferable over the lifespan the microbiota of the environment is to the host, and the relationship it has with chronic illness. Their principal work is looking at implementing the far right, a rewilding of urban environments to try and expose microbial conditions to the people of urban environments through the restoration of biodiversity, and looking at the relationship that that has with ill health. And so, although this work is in its infancy, attempting to apply concepts of increased biodiversity in relation to microbial environments through the holobiont, and making sense of that in relation to non-communicable diseases in their case. So we have all this information, and I'm wary that I haven't really talked about. I certainly have deviated away from the brain, and as Sam mentioned as one of his questions, I've sort of looked outwards and what the environment holds. What does an embodied active inference approach offer in this realm? I believe it offers a framework that enables a unified description from the molecular level to the sociocultural interactions. It really fundamentally embodies this biopsychosocial approach that enables us to look not only at the interactions of our microbiome, but also looking at how we interact at a social and cultural level. Essentially, it allows us to conceptualize our complex systems mapping under a common principle that could be at play at all of those different nodes or variables. That is, that our evolved systems continually attempt to minimize long-term perturbation through the furnishing of refined and diverse generative models. Our ability to interact with diverse environments help to furnish and refine our ability to deal with perturbations in the future. Essentially, our experiences of our body and world are underpinned by this ability to predict the consequences of our actions. And what an embodied active inference approach gets us to sort of consider is that in designing cities that attempt to reduce uncertainty through control, we inadvertently narrow our opportunities for action. Potentially, this leads to an impoverished repertoire of action possibility, which exposes a risk of inadequate accommodation of future bodily perturbation. If we're unable to sort of furnish a repertoire, whether that be the repertoire of the bacteria of the gut, whether that be our ability to commute to work in different ways, we have a less furnished, a less refined ability to deal with perturbation that unwittingly occurs. To me, this really orientates towards what does the city afford us and starts to reform our conceptions of what these key aspects of the built environment are offering us as healthy individuals. Whether we look at our transport systems, our homes, our offices, our neighbourhoods, what an embodied active inference approach potentially gets us to do is reconceptualise what these elements are offering us in terms of furnishing our ability to deal with future perturbation. If we consider our transport systems, often this is about efficiently navigating from A to B, taking the body out of the equation, often ensuring that we can get there with minimal exertion. What impact does this have in our ability to refine our understanding of, or an interpretation of, an elevated heart rate, an elevated breathing rate, an increased temperature? How do we get to know our bodies if we're unable to experience these perturbations? The same is true for homes and offices, where we find ourselves predominantly sitting or lying in an environment that looks to narrow the opportunities for investigation. It therefore seems to me that in seeking efficiency and comfort, we seem to have lost the interactions that define our embodied being, that is very well described within an active inference framework. In some ways, this looks to me as a sort of a philosophical dark room, wrote large. Are we creating a dark city where we have an impoverished opportunity for action that means we narrow our ability to be able to deal with surprise when it occurs? And it inevitably does, and work has been done in allergy that sort of has correspondence with this, where a decreased exposure to particular stressors results in a heightened response later in life. So how do we alter this or flip this idea of perhaps a closed city that refines our opportunities for action to an open city that encourages interpretation, uncertainty? At the sacrifice of perhaps short-term certainty, we have this long-term reduction in perturbation because we're able to explore the options of our phenotype. And I just had to get a picture of the barbican in there as an example of how something that can be considered relatively cold and closed can also, on the other hand, be considered something that is open and redefined over time. And the gardening project at the barbican is thriving. So this is about how do we reinsert the embodied predictive being within its niche? Can we design environments for health in a way that complements our evolved characteristics? Providing access to a diverse range of bodily perturbations throughout the lifespan, from the molecular to the structural. And does this encourage a continual redefinition of bodily bounds through action? Essentially, to come back to where I started, am I calling for, as part of this proposal, the implementation of disorder? But before we all sort of dissolve into anarchy, I guess there are important challenges to note to this work, and that's why it's a proposition and something that is up for discussion. The idea that we haven't adequately characterized the microbiome, understanding the components of the microbiome, its diversity, and how that links with ill health. We also haven't looked at the way in which it exchanges, our exchange with the environment happens over time. A lot of work is done based on cross-sectional work, as I mentioned, looking crudely at urban and rural environments in a snapshot of time rather than the longitudinal nature. Also required is a better understanding of how we might use metrics to define diversity across the levels of explanation, from the molecular to the societal. And as I mentioned in relation to the characteristics of the microbiome, longitudinal investigation to help establish whether there are causal relationships here in relation to chronic illness is paramount to further understanding mechanism. some of this work is proposed and is something that we are looking into at Bath in relation to the ALSPAC data analysis and the ALSPAC study, which is the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children that started in the 90s. It's a birth cohort study based at the University of Bristol. And between 1991 and 1992, 14,000 pregnant women were recruited into the study. And this data encompasses 2 decades of work where biopsychosocial measures were taken from those women, the children and their partners in relation to where they live, the built environment, particular exposures of the built environment, how they commute, their behavioural outcomes, as well as the psychosocial experiences and their interactions with healthcare. A really deep data set that allows us to look at trends and relationships to a much greater extent. In addition, there's some work being done on creating things like urban health indexes, and urban indexes are nothing new, but trying to accommodate the idea of health within them is something that is relatively recent. And this is work done by Centric Lab based in London that attempts to come up with a metric or an index that reflects the psychosocial stresses as well as the environmental stresses in different wards within London. Again, this is work that is very much at a conceptual level and something that needs greater underpinning before it is taken to any explanation or explanatory power. Really, what this sort of dive into this element of research for me has exposed is the idea that the role of health professions is extended through this approach. Can we start to see health professions in our urban planners, our architects, our policymakers? They have the ability to just as much as a traditional health professional in a traditional setting. Essentially, the environment becomes, or the broad environment becomes the setting for health. So in summary, in applying an embodied active inference framework to chronic illness, we consider our adaptive systems caught in a world that no longer furnishes adaptive behaviour. In reducing the diversity of interactions, we are poorly equipped to deal with perturbation when it inevitably occurs. The design of our urban environment is therefore potentially an essential piece of the intervention puzzle when we think about that complex systems approach to counteracting the prevalence of chronic ill health. I'd like to thank firstly everyone for listening and the time to allow me to propose the thinking that has sort of remained within a small group of people. And largely it has been with Louis Rice on the left, who is based in Bristol as an architect, as well as the people that have supported me throughout, Anne, Carolyn, Lorimer, Tash and Chris. In the work that is up to this date. So thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.